Everything rested with the 6 members of the Supreme War Council, most of whom essentially didn't care about the odds against them. They were psychologically blocked, capable only of stumbling forward, the distinguished historian John Dower concluded. Something was needed to free them from their trance. Hardship alone, no matter how severe, wasn't enough. The something had to be qualitatively different from the current mix of conventional arms and strategic pressures, and perhaps it wasn't accidental that the people whose emperor was descended from the sun goddess, and whose word for their nation, Japan, is written with characters that mean origin of the sun, saw the atomic blasts as brighter than 1,000 suns. They signaled more than a new weapon. Their explosions represented more than the equivalent of 10,000 tons of TNT. They announced the appearance of another order of force, greater and more authoritative, and a way out for the land of the rising sun. Perhaps paradoxically, the way out may be seen as supporting an old Japanese belief that mercilessness is the swiftest route to a merciful peace. Japanese hatred of her white enemies was certain to have swelled as their conventional bombs and shells destroyed the country. Were the atomic bombs humane in the long run by quickly ending the war and curbing that? Didn't the Vietnam War's years of peace negotiations take many more lives? All that is, of course, speculative, and nuclear weapons may yet become the scourge of humanity by fatally contaminating the planet, if not demolishing large parts of it. But until then, if and when that happens, Okinawa's caves, killing grounds, and anguish should be remembered, together with the total of deaths there, which was greater than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The ambivalent human record suggests that the first atomic bombs probably prevented the homicidal equivalent of scores more of the same, the 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths if invasion had been necessary, in addition to all the others, Western and Asian. It's difficult to comprehend such figures and to remember the strains of 1945. Focusing repulsion on the bomb is easier, but if a symbol is needed to help preserve the memory of the Pacific War, Okinawa is the more enduring one. 30. Aftermath. General Stilwell, the new American commander, announced the campaign's official end on July 2nd, 9 days after Okinawa had been declared secure. When a final surrender ceremony was held 2 months later, almost all the fighters were gone. The Marine divisions had been relieved by Army troops within days of the June 23rd flag raising and shipped out, some savouring a fairly silly rumour that they were going home. In fact, most went to Guam for rehabilitation and retraining, as mentioned, then to occupation duty on the Japanese mainland and the Asian continent. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, 9 days after the ruin of Hiroshima, flooded Guam with delectable new chatter. Home by Thanksgiving, by Christmas, by Easter, but not Dick Whittaker. In October, his regiment was shipped to China to help repatriate Japanese forces there. After the sweet revenge of watching officers humbly stack their swords, his battalion proceeded to other pleasures. Quartered in the port city of Tsingtao, it had the regiment's highest rate of venereal disease. Demobilized after 8 months in China, Whittaker returned to Saugerties on Memorial Day 1946, in time to watch Main Street's parade. He was still in uniform. There was little defiant trumpeting that the country was number one, but much affection for our boys. Friends hugged him. His hand was pumped for hours. It was, he'd remember, a good day to come home. The spectators dispersed after the parade. His parents walked home, Dick to George Broom's saloon. George looked the same, and the bar stool felt the same. The first beer was on the house, the next was his. The war was over. The circle had closed. It had closed almost completely to those ignorant of battle, for the happy 20-year-old who'd never written home about its real hardships found himself still unable to talk about them now. Combat veterans didn't know how to do that. They didn't want to brag to listeners who lacked the means to comprehend. "What's the point?" Gregarious Whittaker would ask in explanation of his near silence about his life's emotional apex and nadir. "How can anyone know?" Paul Fussell suggests another reason for the fighters' unspoken conspiracy of silence. They'd participated in an event that smeared a monstrous blot on the human race. The appalling outrages to decency so soon after those of World War I left them with a sense of shame for the species supposedly created in God's image. They were happy to forget them. Only other combat infantrymen knew, and none needed reminding, which is partly why veterans preferred swapping funny stories about the screw-ups to revisiting the horror. The funny thing is, they'd say one way and another, I remember more of the amusing incidents than the blood and the gore. Meeting others who did know would give them an infusion of battlefield camaraderie's unique intensity as long as they lived, but their glow needed no extra stimulus then, in 1946. Although Whitaker was saddened to see many more gold stars on the yellowing honour roll over Broom's fireplace, some signifying the deaths of friends, his own name there generated deep satisfaction. After months of beers and laughter, the saloon doors stopped swinging with the newly demobilised. All who had made it through the war were home. Now the party too was over, but Whitaker remained proud. So did almost every American who returned from the edge without crippling injury. He had a lifelong reservoir of pride and self-confidence, even if outsiders would never know what filled it. Mark Jaffe, a first lieutenant who'd broken down with shock during his first fighting on an earlier island, but returned to win a Bronze Star for gallantry below the Shuri line, knew his life had been irrevocably changed. Whenever I ran into physical or psychological hardships later, I thought of Okinawa. I knew if I could survive that, I could survive anything. Jaffe and the others talked as little about the highs as the lows, but they'd never forget. Would they do it again, even with the excruciating fear and misery? You bet they would, especially when asked while basking in their neighbours' grateful admiration and savouring the knowledge that they'd never have to do it again. That was the peak, my proudest moments. I can't explain it, but they were the best days of my life, when I was best. The battle is over, but Japan is still fighting. If we can decrease the enemy's power by even 1 or 2 men, that is our duty. A Japanese straggler on Okinawa. While the band that greeted Whitaker's troopship in San Diego banged cymbals in the hearts of her 1,000-passenger veterans, no music played on the wrecked Japanese piers at which a trickle of Japanese ex-soldiers arrived from Okinawa in wretched defeat. Family members, themselves physically and spiritually traumatized by the ruinous war, welcomed their own with joyful pity, but many held the once vaunted army as a whole in scorn. The memory would remain hateful to most Japanese. In 1963, 18 years after the surrender, less than 1% of all surveyed by a television station remembered the war as the best period of their lives. The exceptions were presumably super-patriots and ex-officers, now in the cold of Japan's powerful post-war anti-militarism. Moreover, most Okinawa veterans felt scarcely human at the time of their homecoming, which was still far off for a good number. The war that was over for Whitaker and his fellows dragged on for the 32nd Army's stragglers. For those thousands during the first months after the collapse of organised resistance, the American flag-raising and surrender ceremonies might as well have been on the moon. Even if the desperate fugitives had heard of the 10th Army's designation of the island as secure, it would have meant nothing to them. "We shot 3 more Japanese last night," a Marine laconically recorded in his diary a week later. When the 32nd Army dissolved, few of its members were alive without some freakish act of providence, perhaps supplemented by their temperament. The surviving 10% probably had a higher than average quotient of initiative and individuality, qualities that would now count even more, as with the inhabitants of the last cave of medic Ikuo Ogiso, the actor turned de facto surgeon. More skeletons than soldiers, the macabre creatures had sunken eyes, uniforms stiff with mud and excrement, and no direction other than their own. When the cave was surrounded, the unit's chief medical officer ordered his 25 nurses' aides to exit and surrender. Calling themselves Yamato Nadeshiko, proud and virtuous Japanese women, those erstwhile students from a less prestigious high school than Ruriko Morishita's pleaded for permission to remain and die with the soldiers, or to join them on a breakout to the north. But the officer remained adamant, and the girls obeyed. Ogiso would later write with relief that his commander although a major in rank and a China veteran, saw his true mission as a medical doctor concerned with preserving life rather than a professional soldier who takes it. Thanks to him, 20 of the girls were eventually saved. 20 precious lives, mothers who now enjoy a peaceful life. The 80-odd men who remained after the aides had left survived remorseless satchel charges and phosphorus bombs, but fear of death drove some to get it over with by running from the mouth. The others burrowed deeper into the vast cave, which was near the southern village of Itosu. In accordance with Divisional Headquarters' last order to continue fighting, passed down from General Ushijima's final message, Ogiso's chief instructed his men to form groups for sorties from the cave. The major then dissolved cyanide in the last of his alcohol and swallowed it, or was injected by an aide, as some near him believed. The cave was too dark for Ogiso to see. Leaving for their final attacks several nights after the 10th Army's declaration of the end of organized resistance, the first groups felt as if a bad dream were animating their limbs. While the bullets inched toward American positions until they were hit by conventional ones, 6 of the most respected and resourceful doctors and senior staff members remained in the cave. They had decided to wait until the enemy's guard went down, and invited the conscientious Ogiso to join them. The modern cavemen devised ways of preserving fire in the eternal wet, the most precious commodity in the world for us. One of the best methods employed cartridge powder, empty cans, and abandoned medical bandages woven into a slow-burning rope. Every flame was tended reverently, in fear of insanity without it. A supply of rotting rice gave the group several days of unhurried nostalgia and lice-picking between continued American explosions. Ogiso's cave was one of the prodigious southern ones that wove and twisted for mile after unexplored mile. Forced by American probes to move deeper into it, the gasping, tottering 7 explored huge reaches of treacherous swampland, jagged mountain ranges, and secret passes unknown even by local Okinawans, a supernatural universe of eeriness and dread. Ogiso supposed the primal fear he felt in the perpetual darkness resembled that of human beings thousands of years earlier. The darkness and thick, sticky air coil around your skin, while a weird aura rises from the grotesquely shaped stalactites and water's slimy surface. To live shut up in that darkness all alone was beyond a normal human being's endurance. The subterranean existence was fashioning a new order of human experience, combining elements of Robinson Crusoe, The War of the Worlds, and Dante's Inferno. Other Japanese encountered in the menacing vastness, for the bands remained almost totally apart, as if belonging to separate tribes, looked like a prehistoric subspecies. Accumulated spectacles of suffering in the gargantuan dungeon finally corroded Ogiso's training and self-discipline. A demented soldier's shriek of "Banzai to the Emperor" as he flung himself to a watery death filled the patriot with deep anger at the once revered deity. "Emperor, do you really know? In your name, in places like this, men are dying unnatural, violent, miserable deaths." Yet the survivors sought to reassure themselves that they'd serve as guides for the forces who would soon arrive to liberate Okinawa. With ships like Yamato leading her superb navy, how could Japan lose? Months in the utterly sunless damp also bred physical affliction. To end the unbearable pain of a stomach disease, Ogiso armed a grenade and pulled the hissing metal to his chest. A doctor in the group kicked it away just in time. When the survivors finally emerged 2 months later, they joined a small army of stragglers who returned to underground refuges throughout the day, but spent nights careering through the countryside. Most began by trying to obey the order to penetrate to the mountainous north. One of the most persistent rumours was of units supposedly intact in a heavily forested area near the island's northern tip. Its name, Kunigami, was whispered as if it meant deliverance or secret superweapon. Shelling had so altered the landscape that finding their way would have been difficult in the darkness, even with a map. The North Star was the primary beacon to the mythical forest holdout, with its vividly pictured food, weapons, and clean water. when band after band was slaughtered attempting to reach it by snaking through the American lines, some thought of swimming there with baskets of debris on their heads intended to blend with the battle's heavy flotsam in the water, or floating to the mainland on rafts. American sentries on beaches leisurely picked them off. But the majority of stragglers simply existed, their goal reduced to staying alive until their rescue by the imagined Japanese counterlanding. The more principled groups agreed among themselves that individuals discovered by an enemy patrol, or injured too seriously to carry on, would unburden the others by killing themselves. But those who kept that promise delivered a fearful blow to their friends, of whom ever fewer were left. The still living roamed fields, smelling of the earth, whose fragrance they might be savouring for the last time, and of the decaying corpses they'd perhaps join before dawn, for they lived in constant dread of being shot at any second. "Thank God American sentries speak loudly even on duty," one man noted. The nightly activity lasted 3 or 4 hours, from when the Americans fell asleep in their tents to the first suggestion of dawn. Failure to return to a burrow or find a new one, even if it reeked with decomposing bodies, was a virtual death sentence. "I wanted to grab the sun and smash it down," a straggler forced to endure the terror of several days above ground would remember. American leaflets proclaiming further resistance useless because Japan had capitulated were half believed. Some wept reading reprints of the Imperial Edict of Surrender. Others predicted that anyone who followed the American instructions for surrender, discard all arms, appear on specified beaches holding up a leaflet, would be tortured to death. Although the majority had lost all desire to keep fighting and used their remaining weapons only to save their lives, they lacked the will to free themselves from their new form of enslavement. Others, or the same men at different times, became determined to kill at least one of their monster hunters before the end. Chased into fields by American pacification units, some groups threw their last grenades at them and were filled with frustration when they didn't explode, or with satisfaction when they heard enemy screams. Others tossed grenades into audiences at outdoor movies or ambushed squads searching for them. The most daring crept into tents and massacred the sleepers, or more often stole food and weapons with growing expertise, sometimes even taking time to search for cigarettes. One team made off with a portable USO phonograph and records of the current American hit songs. Others interrupted their forays to enjoy moments of the open-air movies without trying to disrupt them. The victors lit grass fires to chase the desperados into walls of automatic fire. A straggler who returned alive from a pass covered by a machine gun reported seeing a red river of Japanese blood. When American dogs missed a man despite coming close enough for him to hear their panting, the trembling prey wondered whether it was because his months of bestial life had changed his smell from human to something else. Other terror-stricken groups sniffed the cigarette smoke of search patrols almost on top of them. The Army's rigid class system and class consciousness collapsed. Similar aim and outlook were now what drew together the clusters that formed, and they were led by men of ability rather than rank. One straggler observed that unthinkingly obedient Japanese soldiers had become naked human beings who came together and dispersed by the force of human attraction and repulsion. Officers insulted to their faces by privates nevertheless begged them for admission into their groups. Exclusion or expulsion was a terrible fate, usually leading to starvation as well as the anguish of isolation, that state so achingly contrary to Japanese instinct. Some men joined groups headed for almost certain death at passes covered by machine guns, not out of non-existent hope, but for the last comfort of numbers. Friends promised each other to stay alive, but weaker ones gave up the exhausting work of hiding and allowed themselves to be killed. Other friends swore to each other never to separate under any circumstances, but of course did when bursts of enemy fire scattered them in terrified chaos, or they simply lost touch in the dark. It was great credit to them that a semblance of civilized behavior survived. The most seriously wounded men sometimes begged to be killed for the sake of the others. Some of those unable to join the forays for food would accept none, believing they had no right to it. But although acts of generosity and self-sacrifice were not uncommon among the newly made comrades, most bands regarded all others as rivals, sometimes quarrelling savagely over hiding places and tactics. While some members hated the gigantic Japanese military power that thrust us into this utter misery, with all the intensity remaining in their frail bodies, others threatened to kill anyone who mentioned surrender. Few of either stripe could keep themselves above the struggles over food. By September, an outsider who stole a morsel from a group's supply risked instant death. One ring cautiously dug up a portable safe their unit commander had buried before killing himself. They were ecstatic to find bundles of thousands of 100-yen bills stacked inside, because the paper on which the fortune was printed was enough to cook a canteen of rice. Some groups fought others like bandit gangs for a cache of anything edible, sometimes with swords and to the death. Food included wormy sweet potatoes and worms themselves. Arriving at new caves, starving survivors rummaged feverishly among decomposing corpses. The rucksacks still on the backs of the bodies were putrid with rotting flesh, but the men managed to swallow hardtack that had dried rock-like after its soaking in blood. Perhaps the unluckiest Japanese of all were those who suspected the truth about the end of the war, but feared retaliation by others, mostly non-commissioned officers, who were convinced their duty was to stay ready to join the Japanese counterlanding. Whatever the 32nd Army had suffered before, the surviving stragglers endured more, and by this time for longer than the campaign itself. By early 1946, the several hundred Okinawan soldiers who remained loyal to the Imperial Army lived in the same predicament as the fair percentage of Japanese survivors who wanted to surrender but didn't know how. Although some used the same caves for rest stops, the two nationalities usually remained separate and less engaged in barter. Shinichi Kuniyoshi, the native boy who repeatedly defied death to deliver the message to Yozadake, shared the life of desperate fleeing and hiding. Now 15 years old, he was approaching collapse from exhaustion and the pain of maggots eating his flesh at every cut and scratch. As much as he was able to think at all, Shinichi realized he wanted to continue living, but he had no idea how to give himself up. Masahide Ota was slightly more committed. After his failure to escape by swimming and inexplicable washing ashore, he made his way inland to pursue the instinct for survival, but with no real hope of ending alive. A good half of the normal school's 400 students would survive, but only about a quarter of his class of 128. The starving 20-year-old ran into a fiercely patriotic Japanese second lieutenant, formerly assigned to guard duty at the 32nd Army's Shuri Castle headquarters, and now furious at the traitorous Okinawans whose betrayal had cost Japan the battle. Declaring that locals had no right to be in that sensitive area, he prepared to protect Japanese interests and vent his revenge by shooting the trespasser. Ota saved himself by thinking quickly enough to produce an old document certifying his assignment to intelligence operations. The tattered scrap in his pocket was miraculously still readable after his time in the sea and crawling in the fields. He sustained himself largely from American garbage dumps and the occasional tent into which he tossed a grenade to flush out its occupants before racing in to grab what he could. For companionship, he found an idealistic Japanese private named Shirai, a student of English literature, who, in defiance of everything, had carried a Webster's dictionary with him throughout the battle. When one night's booty from an American tent included a copy of Life magazine, Ota was surprised at how easily his upright older friend was able to read an article accompanying photographs of bomb-ravaged Japan, and amazed when he reported the war was over. Shirai, begging him not to repeat the news to other stragglers, some of whom would kill anyone who said such a thing, implored the youth to surrender. "You're a student, not a soldier. If you can survive and get out of this mess, you must study English. Come to Tokyo. I'll help you if I'm alive." Those fervent words would remain with Ota the rest of his life. They prompted a realization that he'd been a fool who didn't even know the supreme fact that the war was over, and wouldn't have believed it from anyone else's lips. Realizing he'd have remained a prisoner of his false beliefs without Shirai's knowledge of English, he suddenly knew he must stop fighting and start studying. In the end, some surrounded Japanese stragglers agreed to be disarmed, but not to be called prisoners. A sprinkling avoided the disgrace of capture by mingling with Okinawans and learning their ways well enough to avoid detection by the natives employed by Americans to weed them out. After a year, search teams found fewer and fewer stragglers. One discovered in 1972, nearly 27 years after the formal surrender, was almost certainly the last. Almost everyone taken alive in 1945 and early 1946 very quickly considered himself lucky. Jittery, angry Americans continued shooting a few with their hands up, but most of the defeated men ended safely in prison camps, where they weren't tortured but treated to what they took for unimaginable kindness and generosity, and looked back at their straggling days as their grimmest payment for believing Yamato propaganda. The greatest volume of surprise had come in late June 1945, when the greatest number of Japanese surrendered. Loaded onto boats in the south, many regretted not having killed themselves before being taken out for drowning, as they were convinced would happen. But when they reached large camps in the north, hundreds of stripped Japanese blinked in wonder at offers of water and cigarettes from the demons and beasts. One soldier asked for what he believed would be a final cigarette and got 6, which he smoked in a row after his long tobacco deprivation. Kuniichi Izuchi, the proudly patriotic artist, had killed many Americans and was certain he'd be hated as he hated them. But he was amazed by the captives' treatment as human beings rather than enemies. He even sensed a bond with his captors, inconceivable until then. They seemed to understand that he'd fought for love of his country just as they, a sudden revelation, loved theirs. The 22nd Regiment's chief medical officer, the lieutenant who'd grown close to Captain Kojo during the unit's annihilation, was among those astonished by Americans' humanistic behavior. One group of 100 or so prisoners waiting to be crushed by nearby tanks included Kenjiro Matsuki, the former first baseman. They could barely understand when the wounded among them were asked to come forward for trucking to a hospital. Others scarcely believed the rations they were fed, far better than their own during the fighting. Many were reduced to tears at the sight of enemy medics trying to save their dying comrades. American doctors treating maggot-infested Japanese wounds. A surgeon in a hospital tent cut open a cast on the arm of a warrant officer in Tadashi Kojo's battalion and ordered a medic to make a new cast with the wrist up instead of down, because, the doctor explained to the medic, the Japanese held their rice bowls palm up. The warrant officer was unforgettably moved by the surgeon's seemingly immense concern for human life. Izuchi was equally moved by distribution of quinine, as generously as if to American themselves, to malaria-stricken Japanese from Ishigaki Island, where the American pilots had been beheaded. During the first days in POW camps, where minimal rations were received as startlingly generous and normal behavior toward captives seen as magnificent, the invariable Japanese astonishment led to the first serious questioning of their indoctrination, then anger at the authorities responsible for it. Man after man found life as a prisoner of the hated enemy better than as a soldier of the empire, with kinder treatment from their new superiors. But those who hadn't had that revelation because they were still outside the camps clung to their old attitudes and habits, enforced by the diehards among them. Although talk of the benefits of surrender spread among the stragglers, most remained captives of Japanese militarism. Tadashi Kojo had disbanded the last of his battalion on June 21st. In the dead of night, he crept down to the west coast beach with his sword, his adjutant, and their single grenade. Small craft patrolled with loudspeaker messages and machine gun volleys. The two hid behind bushes and boulders, living on hardtack and watching ragged groups flee every which way. Abandoning caution as useless, a few even lit fires to cook sweet potatoes. Kojo's plan was still to smuggle himself to the battalion of a sister regiment in the 24th Division that had reportedly been bypassed by American forces above the Shuri line. Now the remnants, joined by other Japanese from service and airfield maintenance units, and still commanded by Captain Tsuneo Shimura, his academy classmate, were supposedly holding out not far from Kojo's former position at Kochi. Not all appeared lost to Kojo in the strange quiet following the disbanding of his own command. When the Americans stopped firing their big guns, they seemed to pull most of their ground troops inland. Unbelievably, for Japanese forces in that situation would have combed the beaches to completely finish off the enemy. Still, the captain's probing established that enough sentries and patrols were operating to make it almost impossible to sneak through to the north. He reckoned it might be safer for his adjutant and him to round the southern tip and work their way up the east coast. Pressed against the base of the cliffs or burrowed under boulders, hundreds of maimed Japanese hid along miles of shoreline or scurried on the beaches. The captain offered them occasional encouragement, but years later would be most proud of his advice to a young teacher with 5 schoolgirls he spied huddled behind some rocks just as a patrol began cleaning the area with bullets and flamethrowers. When the frightened teacher asked for a grenade, Kojo asked why he wanted it, although he of course knew the reason. "We must kill ourselves, please." The captain postponed his flight from the patrol in order to formulate a persuasive refusal. He and his adjutant needed their 1 grenade for themselves, he said, and teachers had no need of them anyway because unarmed civilians unquestionably wouldn't be harmed. "So you must go up to them and surrender yourselves," he pronounced solemnly. "You aren't military people, and you have no obligation to die for your honor. Do as the loudspeakers say." The enemy edged closer. When their hand grenades joined their bullets and flames, Kojo scurried in one direction, the teacher and pupils in another, not to be seen again. In a moment, something else gripped the captain's attention, the sole of an American boot appearing between 2 rocks directly above him. But its wearer's bullets missed from near point-blank range. His adjutant was First Lieutenant Yatsugi, a trusty Mustang who'd been commissioned during combat in China, then joined him as a replacement during the Kochi fighting. Climbing down a cliff several nights later, the two foraged for sweet potatoes until Kojo hit a tripwire and flares revealed Japanese corpses caught there hours earlier and still bleeding from bullet holes. Enemy soldiers surrounded them as they tried to crawl away. A last-second dash took them back to the cliff, but they lost the trail and couldn't climb up. Enemy rifles approached, glinting in the starlight. This time there would surely be no way out. Between his wild pantings, Yatsugi asked for the grenade. "What for?" Kojo asked again. "This is the end, Captain Kojo. I have to kill myself." "And what about me after you use it? Stop blabbering and follow me." His angry tone belied a calmness grounded in trust that instinct would dictate whether to use the grenade on Yatsugi and himself or on the enemy. The adjutant did follow him to an even more miraculous escape from the cliff, but extreme danger reappeared nights later in one of the breaks between the cliffs where machine guns completely covering stretches of beach chattered throughout the night at the human crabs stealing east and west. This one was in sight of Mabuni Beach, below Ushijima's death ledge, where Kojo wanted to make his penetration inland and north. He and Yatsugi swam seaward to circumscribe its fire, but Kojo had been a weak swimmer even before the grave, still unhealed wound behind his ear, then his further enfeeblement at Kochi and afterward. "We won't make it, let's go back," he shouted to the lieutenant. "No, Captain, I'm going to keep trying." Kojo never saw Yatsugi again. He would guess that his companion may have intentionally drowned. Alone now, the once haughty elitist joined the anonymous nocturnal creatures forming and leaving bands on their intuition about whom to trust. Thirst tortured them even more than in June. Although his seemed as vast as the ocean that blazed all day in the midsummer sun, he learned to avoid the springs that bubbled up from the foot of the cliffs at low tide. Most were littered with corpses over which the weaker-willed Japanese kept crawling in demented craving. American snipers up on the cliffs seemed to prefer the more challenging targets who made desperate dashes. Waiting beneath the same Mabuni cliff several nights later, Kojo strained for sounds of American patrols above. Hearing none, he finally climbed the nearly vertical rise. That feat, nearly inconceivable even if he hadn't been so weak, inaugurated a 2-month crawl in search of the enclave of his fellow battalion commander, 20 miles north as the crow flies. He ate almost anything. He slept in caves, in tombs, and in the open, occasionally on steep slopes, his feet braced against tree stumps to keep from falling. The sharper the incline, the less chance an American patrol would find him and shoot. One night, yearning for a cooked meal prompted him and some temporary companions, they'd been forcing themselves to swallow raw rice and sweet potatoes, to attack a jeep for matches. Bullets sought them out night after night, like rabbits during a hunting season. Enemy rifles fired from so close he could feel their muzzle blasts. Unlike the time with Lieutenant Yatsugi, he trembled violently while waiting for certain death. He tried to decide whether to use a pistol he'd found, knowing the return salvos after a single shot at an American would finish him in a second. The fearful tension of those episodes suppressed even his boundless hunger and thirst. Hours afterward, he remained too drained to open his mouth for a word to a fellow straggler. Nor did his escapes help him penetrate north of the Shuri line, along which he kept crawling until his sweat turned unrecognizably greasy, probably after so much stress with so little nourishment and sleep. The lights of a plane above a field where he wandered alone prompted fantasies of becoming a bird that could fly to his wife and parents to tell them he was alive. He had no explanation for the wild shooting from thousands of enemy guns one mid-August night, tremendous volleys that lit the sky with tracers, no doubt after. Emperor Hirohito's surrender message, which was broadcast on August 16th. But the subsequent cessation of kamikaze attacks, until then the targets of a huge volume of anti-aircraft fire from American ships, was ominous. Japanese encountered in the dark challenged Yama, mountain, and were answered with Kawa, river. Other passwords were Chu, loyalty to the emperor, and Ko, devotion to the family. Some reported that the bypassed battalion he was trying to reach was still operational, inspiring news because its commander, Tsuneo Shimura, was an old drinking friend from Manchuria, as well as an academy classmate. Kojo waited out the severe late-August typhoon that delayed the formal surrender ceremonies by battering American ships en route to Tokyo Bay. Although he still had visions, no matter how absurd, of the arrival of the combined fleet, he believed he had no further duty or right to command anyone but himself. All he wanted was to keep going so he could die a warrior, an honor that beckoned much more brightly than life. The noble ideals absorbed during his Satsuma childhood bolstered his will when exhaustion had seemingly destroyed his body. It took enormous patience and cunning just to learn that his classmate's cave was on some high ground about 5 miles north of Shuri. Visions of it, as the answer to everything, sustained him despite all else. The September night, when he finally reached the cave and contrived to safely enter it in the dark, seemed a sanctified end to his stinking, terrifying odyssey. Overjoyed to see each other alive, the 24-year-old captains held hands and luxuriated in their wonderment and even sense of fulfillment, until Shimura announced he was going to surrender the very next morning. The war, he explained, was over. Japan had been defeated. Dangerously weakened, Kojo went into shock. Staring at his treasured comrade, he thought of his months of hunger, misery, and near-delirious efforts to stay alive in order to reach him, while Shimura quietly elaborated that he felt the Emperor's will must be obeyed. "You're right," the reeling listener finally managed to reply. "You have 300 men to feed and you should surrender. But I'm responsible only for myself. I'm going on alone." The part of him that couldn't accept Japan's defeat was stronger than the part that believed in it. To be gone from the cave when the unit surrendered, the exhausted shell of a man set out again before dawn with a naval warrant officer, a private met along the way, some pistols, and fervent good luck wishes from Shimura. He didn't question why he wasn't obeying the imperial order. He simply knew that his war had to end with his death. Inability to surrender had become an entirely personal matter, unrelated to national concerns. What point could there be in denying the entire meaning of his life by staying alive? The new group wandered to the former headquarters of Kojo's 22nd Regiment below Naha Airfield. From there, they dug through the rubble blocking the entrance to the elaborate adjoining tunnel of the Naval Base Force. The smell and flies were worse than everything previously endured. Lighting a precious match, Kojo saw the bodies of radio men and operations personnel slumped over their transmitters in spaces he'd visited before leaving for combat in April. New slogans summoned from the blood-splattered walls. Japan will never be destroyed. Japan will rise up like a phoenix. Their senses disabled and degradation almost complete, he and the others rummaged for food. More months passed in the dark of a succession of caves. When Okinawan civilians freed from their internment ventured into one of them later in the autumn, Kojo almost shot them for trying to persuade the stragglers to surrender, then realized other civilians would report them sooner or later. Sure enough, a jeep appeared before he'd had time to find another hiding place. The pacification unit consisted of an American driver, 2 Nisei interpreters, and a Japanese officer using an assumed Okinawan name. Their talk about the end of the war and the folly of further resistance was friendly in tone. Kojo stood apart when a second visit convinced most of the cave's inhabitants they wouldn't be killed if they submitted. However, he said to himself, while everyone had an absolute right to surrender, he had his own code. Nevertheless, something intrigued him about an enemy who lacked the slightest hint of a victor's hauteur or display of superiority, even in weaponry. Yes, the truck that accompanied the jeep might well be hiding a machine gun, but the curiously relaxed Americans didn't carry even pistols. Kojo had never seen a Marine outside of combat and the parties that had been hunting him. Could his image of arrogant murderers be wrong? A voice told him to put an end to further thought by killing himself right now. The time had come again. Another voice observed that he alone was still trying to be a warrior. The enemy seemed to have moved on to new goals, apparently related to an entirely different kind of life. He'd been prepared for Americans flourishing guns and for insults to his honor. He'd have shot anyone like that who entered the cave, then shot himself, but would such a display make sense now? The first party had asked the stragglers to please prepare to give up their weapons. Some now did, others had buried theirs. Telling himself it was the responsibility of the senior Japanese present to observe carefully, Kojo inched closer. Then, in a kind of trance, he handed his pistol to an American lieutenant, which the latter returned, asking how to unload it. Was he an enemy or a wiser man? Kojo's realization of how easily he could have shot the lieutenant forced him to accept that the war had ended. He returned the pistol to the American, who invited him into the jeep. After 5 months of nocturnal existence, the sunlight blinded. When the men had been loaded into the truck, they were driven to a military police post and given cigarettes, then to a POW camp in the north. The last substantial group of Japanese POWs was repatriated in the spring of 1947, 2 years after L-Day. Kojo had had the luck to be released a year earlier, in late March 1946. He returned to bombed-out Tokyo and by train to leveled Kagoshima, where he spent almost a year in immobilized depression in a corner of his parents' house. Throughout the country, returning soldiers, those losers in their often terrible physical condition, were despised. Many became outcasts. In addition to the battle and the war, Kojo in particular had lost his beloved wife Emiko, whose parents were influenced by the severe social changes that turned Imperial Army officers from figures of admiration to objects of contempt. He himself shared the new anti-militarism. His first job, obtained with a fake resume to conceal his military profession, was as a laborer at an American airbase. When he became a driver for an American high in the Occupation Administration, he resisted the influential lawyer's attempts to persuade him to join Japan's new self-defense force. Although he badly needed a better-paying job to support a new family, memories of Okinawa kept him a driver, even as his mental and physical strength slowly returned. "Japan doesn't need an army," he replied. "Japan must never fight again." Eventually, however, he did join the self-defense force, and in time advanced to captain again, before retiring in 1970. 50 years after his fighting, the scrupulously neat ex-soldier walked with some of his old ramrod straightness. One of the smaller post-war ironies is that the average Japanese survivor of the battle, that relative handful, is in better physical condition than the average American. Many also appear more prosperous, but not Kojo, who ignored friends urging to apply for a pension for his war wound, the permanently damaged hearing. "No, I can't sell my ear to my country," he answered. "I must feel I did my duty." Post-war Japanese politicians who awarded themselves honors and rewards gave nothing to the veterans who returned half alive from Okinawa. Kojo is among the probable majority of ex-POWs who never lived down the stigma of captivity, although his came only after the destruction of his battalion, Japan's surrender, and his grueling months as a straggler. The old samurai in the Satsuma Sun lived on in devotion to the memory of General Ushijima, Colonel Yoshida, commander of his 22nd Regiment, and all who fought to the last and died in the fields or in the water in order to defend Okinawa. His loyalty was coupled with resentment of those who refer to the Imperial Army in flippant tones, and indignation that the superb conduct and sacrifice of our great army and the special attack forces at Okinawa are less celebrated than the tragedy of Okinawan civilians represented by the Princess Lily Brigade, or well-publicized atrocities committed on Okinawans by a few desperate soldiers. Anti-militarists who insinuate that Okinawans are the only victims disturb him particularly. "That's enough," I'd like to plead. "It's time to stop." Yet the war changed Tadashi Kojo radically, starting with liberation from the narrow focus of the Imperial Army officer. The once feared battalion commander now takes great interest in the outside world. He has also returned to his boyhood literary interests, using the English he taught himself after the war to work as a translator after retiring from the self-defense force. From his present peaceful life, the articulate, attractive 80-year-old looks back in horror and wonder at his former one as a rigid officer whose entire being was devoted to battle for honor and the emperor. When Okinawans look back, it's with little hope others will ever appreciate the battle's impact. Clarence Clacken's The Great Luchu ventures the illusion that the resilient people showed remarkable ability to stand up under physical and mental strain, the survivors having suffered little physical deterioration except for filth, disease, and lice infestations. In fact, their cataclysm, if it didn't surpass Hiroshima's and Nagasaki's, lasted far longer. After most of the battle's explosives had fallen on them rather than the two armies, decimated families clung to life as if by their fingernails. Perhaps the point is made by the fact that the civilians who visited Tadashi Kojo's cave in November 1945 came in search of food from the wretched Japanese stragglers inside, who were themselves barely alive. Okinawans ate almost anything in 1946 and 1947, including dogs. As in post-war Germany, their condition generally worsened yet further from what it had been during the fighting. With virtually every settlement in ruins, they had only scraps from the rubble for building shelters. Tens of thousands lived in cartons, tar paper, and other American refuse, but no nearer than a mile to the bases and billeting areas, whose security and health were protected by prohibiting them from coming closer, never mind that it was their land. Meanwhile, they blinked at their occupiers' construction. Even during the battle, their admiration and dismay at the enemy's ability to alter nature with his explosives had been deepened by their first sight of instant roads and airfields. The American works, massive in terms of the island's history and scale, were inaugurated the day after L-Day, when young men jumped into huge construction machines as soon as areas behind the lines were judged relatively safe from Japanese artillery. Even in April, a pilot reported that much of the captured land looked more like a construction site or highway project back home than a battlefield. By June, Army engineers and Navy Seabees were well advanced in their transformation of selected areas into a Little America and an arsenal for the invasion of the mainland. A pre-war project to build a north-south highway the length of the island had been estimated to require 10 years. Emerging from underground, natives gasped when they saw American know-how, and machines had already completed much of the job. However, the spectacular blasting and bulldozing were done with no notice of their concerns. Village remains were knocked flat to accommodate military projects, their rubble added to the new roadbeds. Entire hillsides of tombs were destroyed and paved over without a word of protest, since no native aware of the sacrilege was anywhere in sight. Too poor to return to traditional styles when they themselves at last began building anew, the desperately ill and unhoused Okinawans turned instead to the cheapest, most accessible alternative: American military base design. A proliferation of stark concrete squares, cheap and fast to pour, spread over the South like a Marxist nightmare of proletarian hovels. Soon the valleys of some of the world's most graceful architecture were cursed with some of ugliest, a sprawl of garages, cheap shops, and instant slums. Perhaps Okinawan culture was in any case destined to be submerged in Japanese and American in the ordinary 20th century way. But the obliteration of almost all the old, important, and beautiful greatly hastened and expanded the process. The destruction of tens of thousands of family tombs was especially damaging. The 32nd Army's fortification of a selection of them had disturbed some natives more than anything else in the defensive preparations. Since those little homes where the living would join their ancestors' spirits were built and maintained in order to fulfill life's purpose, they viewed their use for military functions as profoundly offensive. Their subsequent devastation during the fighting was inevitable. Once American infantrymen learned some were serving as pillboxes and machine gun emplacements, they used the full range of their weaponry to demolish thousands in their path. The poor Okinawans, General Stilwell put it with characteristic bluntness, have had even their ancestors blown to pieces. Not only blown, but also tossed into the mud like used rations. The little structures could provide a sensational dry night while rain soaked everything outside, what Thomas Hanaher called living with the dead to stay alive. However, those dead were often disposed of. Seekers of souvenirs as well as shelter removed their beautiful ceramic urns, often dumping and scattering their bones in the process. Although Okinawan's uncommonly strong family and spiritual life did help the survivors get through with remarkably few nervous breakdowns, mental illness soon soared to a higher rate than anywhere else in the Pacific. Psychiatrists believe a significant cause was the destruction of the tombs that had remained at the core of native culture and belief until the battle. People whose emotional health had been nourished by the security of ancient family roots could neither pay tribute to their ancestors nor complete their own lives by joining them. With so many tombs smashed and so many parents and grandparents killed, younger generations grew up unable to find their homeless family spirits, a shocking condition for both living and dead. The occupation of the island that would endure until 1972, fully 20 years longer than the mainland's, was characteristically American. Often generous in personal ways and in response to individual cases of hardship, usually ignorant of and insensitive to native ways and needs. When Commodore Perry had compelled Okinawans to satisfy his reasonable demands almost a century earlier, he was certain they'd appreciate American lenity and humanity. Now Americans who paid wages to civilian laborers and distributed free rations, the only antidote to mass starvation, were similarly convinced of their traditional magnanimity, especially after billions of dollars began flowing into the economy in support of operations for the Korean War and other anti-communist operations. But although the selective medical assistance and scholarship grants were indeed admirable, the 27 years of occupation brought far more shame than honor to the Pentagon and the men in the field who, again like Perry, tended to ignore official noises of good intentions from Washington. Japanese-speaking naval officers, some trained in Asian studies and civilian administration, did good work during the occupation's initial year or so. Without doubt, reported a Navy-commissioned study of the impact of the invasion and occupation in February 1946. Our military operations in Okinawa have caused far greater disruption, destruction and casualties than any previous violent historical episode in the archipelago, and cannot be regarded by the people as anything but a calamitous disaster. But its quality and integrity plunged when it was taken over by the army, most of whose senior officers knew nothing about their jobs and hardly cared to learn, since they were considered a detour from line command and its promotions. After Masahide Ota became a scholar and journalist, he'd rightly conclude that the military government was dominated by officers who felt little sympathy for scourged Okinawa's moonscape or for her ruined people. They resented their assignment to a now blackened, desolate island instead of the far more interesting Japanese mainland. To put it simply, they neither liked their work nor had a professional understanding of it. Even the exceptional local commanders with the ability and inclination to learn about native traditions and concerns hardly had time, because the army rotated them almost annually. No fewer than 22 generals governed during the 27 years of American rule, and Pentagon officials changed almost as rapidly as the come-and-go occupation personnel. As Ota charged, Okinawan duty was considered undesirable enough to be threatened as punishment for goof-ups. The island became notorious as a place of exile from the Japanese mainland, a veritable Siberia, as George Kerr called it, otherwise known as the end of the line, or Botany Bay, for incompetent colonels and civilian bureaucrats, in much the same way as Tokyo had sent down second-rate administrators during its 1879–1945 rule. Soon only a few overseas eccentrics gave a damn about the remote possession. Back home after the campaign, the combat veterans whose unintentional shooting of women and children had given them their inkling of the civilian calamity wanted only to forget their nightmares. Resuming their civilian lives in the post-war boom, they knew nothing about the abysmal conditions on the island, and couldn't know because the draconian control of the United States, as John Dower called it, was accompanied by censorship and secrecy. Throughout the occupation, and indeed until 1955, no news reports or commentaries about Okinawa were published in the press, making the image of that virtually invisible prefecture as a penal colony seem perfectly reasonable. The vacuum of public interest and accountability allowed the generally negligent and substandard occupation to go unnoticed. The force was composed not of combat troops who'd seen at least some of the battle horror, but of callow youth, as one of their officers called them, who demanded their creature comforts from the armed services. And from the Okinawans, just under 100 of whom they robbed and assaulted and murdered during the first 6 months of 1949 alone, predictable distractions of occupation troops banished to an impoverished backwater. Those youths felt condescension or scorn for the Japanese who eked out their existence without commerce or currency. Especially during the first post-war years, when family land was the sole source of self-support and the army paid no compensation for what it seized, scavenging natives lived in miserable poverty, some in areas ravaged by malaria, all in deep shock and bewilderment. "One must face the fact," wrote the naval officer who studied the island's condition, "that our operations and base developments have reduced seriously and permanently the future capacity of Okinawa to support human life by agriculture." But the fact was ignored. In 1947, an American soldier with the Corps of Engineers described Naha as just piles and mounds of stone and concrete fragments, divided into large sections by what appeared to be roadways that had been bulldozed through the ruins. "This looks exactly like the Somme," said a visiting British official about the material and human debris, while bulldozer flotillas were levelling the remains of tombs, cemeteries, and other hallowed sites for bomber runways. The dumping ground for army misfits, to quote Ota again, served the same function for war surplus and junk. The transitory occupation commanders were so little interested in native needs and so high-handedly autonomous that a witness described an assistant secretary of the army as flabbergasted with what he saw during an unannounced visit in 1949. Although some of the worst outrages were remedied, native hardship remained severe until the late 1950s. One of the war's enduring ironies is the far more generous treatment of the aggressive Japanese home islands. While they were gearing up for their impressive economic recovery, Okinawa remained in deep poverty, partly owing to the unconcerned generals who conducted their occupation more repressively than on the mainland. After all, their real business was operating America's defense installations, not caring for natives. Thus was the hardest punishment administered to peace-loving Okinawans who'd been least responsible for the war that hurt them most. The unsupervised Pentagon's freedom to run the rock like one big military complex was hardly accidental. On the contrary, it resulted from traditional attitudes and conscious calculations by the powers that had devastated it. Shortly after the Meiji government had fully seized the Ryukyu archipelago in 1879, it offered to divide it and give half to China. Tokyo's motive in 1945 remained the same: benefit to the Japanese mainland. Once more it used Okinawa as a bargaining chip, now in negotiations with Washington. Having gambled that the massively costly struggle for the outpost would deter or delay an invasion of the home islands, it sacrificed Okinawa again. This time the purpose was to save the mainland from further disturbance and disgrace if it hadn't been able to sever the incinerated battlefield from Japan, a dishonest legal maneuver, and help send the bulk of American forces to its silenced territory. The plans and purposes of the mainland's occupation were drawn by American civilians. For Okinawa, however, the task was left to the combat forces that waged the battle. The difference was crucial. As intended, it gave overwhelming preference to military considerations. For its part, Tokyo didn't object to placing its most shell-shocked citizens under foreign military rule for nearly 30 years. On the contrary, it volunteered to donate the island to the United States, like a bone thrown to divert the victors from larger demands on those sacred home islands. The same government that had tried to cajole traditionally peaceful Okinawans into joining the frantic wartime sacrifice by hawking racial unity now reverted to its old, deep-rooted view of them as inferior and dispensable. Their voting rights were abolished. Stripped of the protection of Japanese laws and post-war agreements with Washington, the characteristically pliant and now prostrate people could only submit. The unhampered American occupiers needed only occasional resort to bayonets and bulldozers to lawfully expropriate the land they wanted for their new installations. That made perfect sense to them, because while they never saw the Japanese mainland chiefly as their military outpost, Okinawa was basically strategic, as General Douglas MacArthur confirmed, that same supreme commander whose Tokyo headquarters dubbed the emperor the First Gentleman of Japan, and was entertaining members of the imperial household. More than that, he called the Ryukyus America's natural frontier. No one in Washington objected to the relentless militarization of Okinawa by the same Far Eastern Command that was implementing its anti-militarist reforms on the mainland. It's not too much to say that Japan's post-war constitution, with its celebrated renunciation of war and its means, rested on the severed island's militarization. American installations, among the largest and most important concentrations outside the continental United States, soon occupied a fifth of the chronically overcrowded island, including much of the most desirable, flat farmland in the central and southern areas. Just because the pacifist people's Holocaust had gone virtually unknown, they who'd suffered more grievously than almost any other during the war were made to suffer more. On went the largely single-minded military rule for decades. By 1971, Berlin was the only other major area under occupation as a residue of World War II. While Okinawans looked back at the war as confirmation that the island's salvation lay in their pacifism, not every last one of them regretted having fought for Japan, especially among the young and the elite. But the handful of exceptions proved the rule of enormous regret and corresponding mistrust of everything involving war. If most Japanese turned fervently anti-militarist after the war, an even greater proportion of Okinawans did so even more passionately. Still deep in devastation, people remembered prophetic warnings that the militarization would invite attack by Westerners with whom they, the inhabitants, had no quarrel. Their overriding lesson from the battle was that far from protecting them from anything, as the Japanese army loftily promised it would from bestial American invaders, military bases on their land invite their destruction, and that it would be greatest right there, not at the command centers of the foreign powers that maintain the installations, and that civilians would suffer most. That was their chief reason for voting to revert to Japan in 1972. They'd been encouraged to believe that after 27 years of an occupation configured to Pentagon blueprints, the bases would be eliminated or much reduced. Instead, a Japanese-American defense treaty of the same year, drafted and signed without consulting them, assigned the United States rights to their extended use. Maintenance of those bases was the key to the entire reversion bargain, which included additional secret arrangements for the two powers to trade Okinawan favors. Japanese officials promised Washington its commanders would continue enjoying far greater freedom of action there than on the mainland, which they did and still do. American veterans who returned in 1987 were surprised to find skyscrapers, choking traffic, and a crazy quilt of stores and shops on the pre-industrial landscape they'd left 42 years earlier. Some made the trip largely to visit cemeteries. James Hall found the grave of a buddy killed in April 1945. "I visited my fallen comrade, and it was as if time stood still. I can only say that something that has been a part of my life for all this time has been put to rest." But the chief purpose of the mass visit was to attend the unveiling of a joint monument to the dead of the 32nd Army and the 6th Marine Division. "We hope, as at our Gettysburg, our wounds will be healed by recognizing gallantry on both sides," wrote Edward "Buzzy" Fox, organizer of the American fundraising campaign. He was justly proud of the international beacon to the world showing that peace is possible, war a waste. The climactic moment came at a banquet, when the Japanese and American contingents, which had previously sat apart, were asked to shake hands. That was very hard for some, especially those who'd forced themselves to return to the place of their deepest misery. But many who did take a giant step toward reconciliation by reaching out to touch the former enemy felt great relief. A few embraced men whom they'd only wanted to kill, kill, kill. "I should have done this years ago," said one. "I have lived a life full of needless hate. It is gone now, and I feel at peace with myself and the world." American participants were buoyed with a feeling of purification and even joy. It wasn't simply that "it's better to eat together than to fight each other," as one put it, but the fulfillment of an inner yearning to make peace and cast off hate. A man who'd lost his right leg and his best friend during the battle drank and laughed with Japanese veterans who were also missing limbs. "This was a wonderful event, and I am so happy I could be there." William Manchester was among the veterans who had bitterly opposed the blasphemy of a joint memorial with the Japanese. After Stuart Upchurch made the trip with a replacement he'd looked after when the latter was wounded just after Sugar Loaf, the tough former machine gunner penned an open letter to the distinguished writer who could never forget Japanese atrocities. Some men of both nationalities wept silently, and a few even openly. If only they, and their people, their governments, had known 40 years earlier what they now knew. The monument's third side is dedicated to the Okinawan dead. "As it is in all wars," said an American contributor, "the soldiers are paid to fight and die, but the hapless island people were total victims." Recognition of the scope of the civilian tragedy came late and only partially to veterans of both armies. Some began glimpsing it in the late 1980s when they, approaching their 70s, grappled with thoughts of their own mortality. By 1990, when only 2 of the flag raisers on the southern tip were alive, veterans' associations were spending a fair part of their time returning souvenirs, many members regretting their youthful appetite for them. Okinawan families who'd lost everything during the battle were profoundly grateful for the smallest scraps. 42 years after the battle, an ex-Marine sent back a postcard that a soldier serving in Manchuria had mailed from there to a buddy's 5-year-old daughter back on Okinawa. The card said the father had died bravely, and often spoke of the daughter, who, 48 years old when she saw it again, was overcome. It took the Virginia Military Institute longer to give back its booty. Pressure had to be applied by highly placed veterans before a 15th-century Buddhist bell, which a Marine general had given the school as a trophy of war, was returned in 1991. A few other irreplaceable national treasures, of the handful of undamaged ones, continued to serve as decoration for American homes and gardens. But individual Americans, increasingly preoccupied with their moral record as they approached the end of their lives, were more eager than institutions to put things right. One of the matters that most troubled Joe Bangert, the iconoclastic medical corpsman, was shooting a stand of moving trees that turned out to be not Japanese soldiers, but Okinawan nurses. Bangert's wife realized how much the incident had been on his mind for over 40 years, just before. He died. He told her he knew war was hell, but he never thought he'd kill a woman. It bothered him terribly. One of the unveiling speakers was James Day, the corporal who'd fought on Sugar Loaf and went on to assume command, well in the post-war period, of all American forces on the island. An uncommon friend of the Okinawan people, Day noted that compared to the civilian deaths, the military losses in history's largest and longest major battle almost pale in significance. It is a stark documentary to the folly of mankind. It is a stark documentary to the foolishness of war. Such confirmation from a general might seem to have provided a decent ending to the Okinawa story, if not yet to the foolishness of war. However, little justice or fairness is yet in evidence. For all the recent decline in overt racism, for all the growing recognition that all nationalities live in one world, where what's bad for them must in the long run also be bad for us, some of the Pacific War's underlying causes endure. Americans still cherish their sense of moral superiority, recently reinforced by the assumption that their military supremacy is conferred by a kind of divine right. For her part, Japan nurtures an equally firm conviction of her superiority, and the Japanese fighting spirit, although no longer directed to conquest, remains central to the national ethic. And neither superior nation has yet done right by Okinawa after doing so much wrong. Mile after mile of base fences flank the major roads. Vast airfields and military housing complexes occupy the choicest sites. At least 15% of the most fertile farmland is buried under runways. Even if some of the airfields or roads are abandoned after having served their purpose, there will be little prospect of restoring fertility to the hard, coral-filled strips for many years, one sympathetic American analyst warned in 1946. Rather than abandoning the airfields during the next 45 years, however, the military authorities lengthened them and thickened the concrete. Picture the reaction if something similar were imposed on the good people of, say, Long Island or Dade County. The land of constant courtesy, with its long history of toleration, compromise, and peaceful relationships with its neighbors, a history in sharp contrast with those of mission-bent Japan and America, lives with inescapable daily intrusions. They take place on the ground, where our servicemen, according to the Okinawan police, have committed nearly 5,000 crimes, including mugging, molesting, and murdering, since the reversion, and far more during the arguably illegal American occupation. They also take place in the air, where screaming jets, operating with a freedom decreed by imposing severe restrictions on airspace allocated for civilian use, produce 100 decibels from early morning to late evening. And they take place in the sea, where poisonous chemicals are secretly dumped. Muggings, taxi robberies, sexual misconduct, and other delinquency by base personnel, of course, continue. Seedy night business still surrounds some bases. Live firing exercises still cause brush fires, bullets ricochet from ranges into adjoining civilian areas, errant parachute drops damage property, and sugarcane fields are scarred by emergency landings of warplanes that benefit Okinawans as much as the Great Wall of China does. American domination of precious water resources has of course ended, but hillsides pockmarked by artillery fire and ridges sliced for helicopter landing pads continue sending streams of red silt into the sea. However, Okinawa's aversion to the military presence comes from something deeper in its soul and stronger than nostalgia for its long history of non-aggression. The shiny jets that American airmen park at their base gates with understandable pride make natives shudder. The prized military hardware provokes insecurity on their own island. A dissenting American recently called the transformation of a profoundly anti-militarist island into a kind of supercarrier for a foreign power, a long-term murder of the entire island culture. Japanese and American veterans who return as tourists often gape at the rising sun and stars and stripes flying side by side from tall flagpoles. Okinawans see them less as ironic than as symbols of their centuries-old subjugation. The American participation began in 1853, when Matthew Perry pointed his big guns at the utterly inoffensive islanders and made his brazen, unprovoked demands. Determined to secure a military base there, Perry even claimed suzerainty over the Ryukyus. By the time his report of that reached Washington, a new president ordered it to end because he was convinced it would require congressional approval. Still, the Commodore compelled the captive Ryukyu monarchy to sign the flagrantly unjust Friendship Treaty that established a permanent anchorage for the United States, a proclamation of American needs that scarcely changed when General MacArthur reasserted it. The United States had to maintain dominion over the Ryukyus, the Supreme Commander insisted, because they were absolutely essential to the defense of our Western Pacific frontier. In my opinion, failure to secure it for control by the United States might prove militarily disastrous. To avoid association with 19th-century imperialism, the defense of that frontier, 6,000-odd miles from the actual one, is said to greatly benefit Okinawans too, just as Japan claimed throughout her much longer mistreatment of the island. Pentagon strategists maintain it still needs our protection, now against latently expansionist China. They see Okinawan bases as the linchpin of America's Far East strategy for countering that. Some military experts doubt they're a right or necessary linchpin, or that Okinawa is suitable for training troops. Hawaii or Guam, both apparently willing to accept a transfer, would be better. More than that, they argue that withdrawing our installations from the island, dangerously vulnerable to missile attack, would enhance our Pacific defences by freeing us from an obsolete Cold War stance that also impedes the rapid deployment of the highly mobile forces demanded by current crises. But whatever the rights and wrongs of that dispute, world powers' pursuit of their own strategic interests is precisely what has long tormented Okinawans. They might consider the burdens less onerous if they could understand their benefit to them. Even before the Soviet Union's collapse, some were emboldened to ask what the bases were protecting them from. Never having had an argument with Moscow, and not now having any with Beijing, the majority fear them far more than any imaginable foreign threat. That is to say, the purportedly protecting installations, with their dangerous equipment and potential as targets, represent more menace than any conceivable enemy. Not all are troubled. A minority, conspicuously including those who benefit most directly from ground rents, bar sales, and retail income, want our 27,000 servicemen to remain. The number of hypocrites making profit and political hay from the American presence is no smaller than that of the champions of Japanese nationalism and militarism before the war. Others fear a reduction in subsidies from the national government, which also pays the base rents for Washington. The poorest of Japan's 47 prefectures, whose people tend to stroll in a southerly manner rather than dash to work in the morning, has grown accustomed to those subsidies. The question is further complicated by the hugely disproportionate share of the Japanese self-defense force they also unwillingly host, causing many even more anxiety than does the American behemoth. Not long ago, a British writer lamented that after many years living and travelling on the home islands, he could count on the fingers of one hand the Japanese who reacted to me as just another human being. But although that experience is common for gaijins there, where even the most polite receptions seem stiffened by inhibition, foreign visitors to Okinawa are treated to a markedly easier, warmer atmosphere. The casually hospitable natives attach far less importance to nationality, except, paradoxically, in the case of their fellow citizens from the mainland. Statistical evidence supports travellers' observations that many feel more comfortable with Americans than with ethnic Japanese, some of whom continue to treat them as racial inferiors. A survey in 1982, 10 years after reversion, found that over 40% of Okinawans felt awkward with Japanese from other prefectures. Less than 5% had formed friendly relationships with them, although that figure has surely increased since then. "We like you," they tend to tell us. "We just wish you'd take your weaponry elsewhere. But if the bases must stay, many quietly prefer them to remain in American hands than to be given over to the Japanese. However, distrust of mainland intentions hasn't changed a clearly expressed wish for relief from the huge military establishment. Polls reveal that the great majority, an unusually consistent 80% since 1982, want the installations eliminated or sharply diminished. Japan's recent economic troubles, which are particularly severe on tourism-dependent Okinawa, have softened that position, but not by much. Despite that, our policymakers continue claiming that the bases afford the island great economic as well as security benefits. Adjusted for political correctness, they echo the US High Commissioner who, shortly before the reversion, admonished that a base-deprived Okinawa would revert immediately to a barefoot economy, dependent on sweet potatoes and fish. That argument flies in the face of the experience of the Philippines, where military spokesmen also predicted bankruptcy, when Manila demanded the closing of even larger US bases at Clark Field and Subic Bay, whereas new commercial ventures on the vacated sites in fact sparked an economic spurt in the early 1990s. But on goes the old canard about economic ruin, while the speck of others' land remains captive to our global objectives. Elderly 10th Army veterans who oppose losing the island where so much of their blood was spilled tend to relent when informed of the vastly greater volume of Okinawan blood that soaked the same land. But when other objections fail, American spokesmen usually fall back to another supposedly decisive argument. We have a defense treaty with Japan. Besides, the Japanese want us to remain on Okinawa. Their Japanese counterparts like to end the debate with the complementary clincher. We have a treaty with America, and it requires us to accommodate her military needs. But that treaty was the one conceived 29 years ago in the tension of the East-West struggle and forced on Okinawa without consultation. Why shouldn't it be rewritten? The test for the fairness and decency we like to claim is even simpler than asking what we'd want if we were in the Okinawans' shoes. It's to ask what they themselves want. Yes, the national government in Tokyo has legal sovereignty over the island. But could Washington compel the people of, say, Oregon or Michigan to maintain an immense, unwelcome military establishment on their best land? How long would Americans of any state tolerate that? How long would Congress persist? Yet these 10 years after the evaporation of the global communist menace, the Pentagon that undertook to make significant changes in that eventuality still wants its outpost, and the Japanese government continues shunting the unwanted installations to the disposable land of the Okinawans, 900 miles south. With the promised peace dividend still unseen, more and more Okinawans are overcoming their traditional reluctance to assert themselves. During the summer of 2000, 27,000 held hands to encircle the giant Kadena base, site of Tadashi Kojo's original position, in protest, while other residents pursued suits against Washington and Tokyo for harming them with, among other things, massive air and noise pollution. Although their anti-militarism hasn't yet advanced to insurgent anti-Americanism, the swelling exasperation is less likely to disappear than to one day cost more than their strategic bargain is worth. Why they remained docile so long is less important than their waxing resentment of the exploitation that continues into the new millennium. Their seemingly immutable occupation, which is essentially what our overpowering military presence amounts to, keeps them haunted by the ghosts of the war that sent them to their inferno. After that catastrophic illustration of fortifications bringing death rather than the promised salvation, they now fear that the present bases may again engulf them in war, which reflects as much wisdom for their own land as do the global calculations of the Pentagon and White House. As for the Japanese, a few visionary veterans took the lead in building the 1987 memorial and reconciling with their former American enemies. The years have flown. Half a century, reads the inscription on their side of the monument. As we remember our friends long gone, let us ring out the bell of peace. But for all the generosity of that small core of internationalists, for all the Japanese sentiment for their dead, especially among those who visit Okinawa, the government's continued shunting of American military activities to the island gives living Okinawans little peace. As we've seen, the native hope that reversion to Japan would bring a significant reduction in the size and number of the bases so that the island would become a little better to live in, remains ignored. Japan isn't primarily to blame for Okinawans remaining the nation's poor relatives. Although per capita income increased from 60% of the mainland's at the 1972 reversion to 75%. Since then, Okinawa Prefecture remains the poorest of the 47, with the highest unemployment rate. But Tokyo's continued concentration of the defense establishment on the racially non-Japanese island prolongs the old imposition of its will on the former colonials, and it includes continued banning of the kind of foreign investment that helped ignite prosperity elsewhere in Asia. Okinawa's 0.6% of Japanese territory is, remember, crammed with almost 75% of the regular, as opposed to contingency American-used bases and installations in all the 47 prefectures, and is staffed by almost three-quarters of all American personnel. That, together with the extremely lopsided share of self-defense force installations, is forced on a people whose museums display weapons only in anti-war exhibits. On it goes, the old pattern of using the island as an expendable or sacrificial outpost, a stepping stone, a dumping ground. The present impositions are far less oppressive than Satsuma's, and lack the naked presumption of the Perry Party that planted Old Glory, as if they'd discovered the island. But the old mentality endures in Japan even more than America. Although the 3-month delay of American forces on the island saved the mainland from stupendous destruction, its people, who should feel the greatest need for restitution, are still exploiting the weakness that enabled their predecessors to make a pawn of Okinawa since the early 1600s. Actually, the typhoon of steel and bombs wedged the pawn more firmly between the rock and hard place of Japanese and American imperialism, with their goals that are alien to Okinawa's nature and destructive of her land. But if the smoke and smell of World War II's last dirty deal darken the island, other aspects are bright. Tourists who arrive expecting a more southern Japan quickly sense they're in a different culture altogether, with a much softer ambience. The difference is palpable the moment they step from the plane and find themselves at home amid the easier smiles and more rhythmic gaits in the old kingdom of the Ryukyus. Whereas economic achievements are less impressive than on the mainland, the hospitality and happiness quotients are noticeably higher, and it matters little to most natives whether or not the people they make room for in their bars are foreign. Okinawa continues to have many of the troubles of island communities dominated by a richer, more powerful neighbour, including a mixture of dependence and resignation to inferior status, punctuated by ineffectual talk and rare flashes of resentment. But to the extent that any generalization of this kind is valid, it is again a sunnier, emotionally healthier place than either of the powers that still dominate its economy and fate. Its passionate clusters of resident Japanese and American admirers are held there not by sadness over the destruction, but by love of the tolerant, artlessly welcoming social climate, the innate sense of human community that puts them at ease. Where the scars have healed and the tawdry post-war sprawls are not in view, it is a beautiful as well as a friendly island. Despite the predictions of Americans who observed the devastation in 1945, Shuri Castle was rebuilt. More precisely, a reproduction was constructed for the 50th anniversary of the battle's end, and the loving creation affords a glimpse of the old harmony and beauty. Masahide Ota, the fervent member of the Blood and Iron Scouts for the Emperor, whose revelation came when the friendly Japanese soldier read to him from Life magazine, gave himself up in late November, 5 months after the battle's official end. In his internment camp, he whittled a bamboo stick into a pen and used his morning coffee as ink to write and rewrite Shinsei, a new birth, and Saisei, rebirth. Following that self-admonition and his sudden passion to learn English, the former normal school student worked his way into Tokyo's Waseda University, then to graduate study at Syracuse University. He went on to become a professor at the University of the Ryukyus, a prolific writer in Japanese and English, a forceful critic of the battle tactics that caused the terrible damage to the island Japan claimed to be defending. Challenging the notion that 1945 was a nightmare of the past, the ardent promoter of Okinawan identity, insists its lessons are totally relevant to the present. More than anything, he sees them in the indoctrination that deceived him, and in illusory national needs that crush bodies, spirits, and human interests in the name of empty words such as the will of the state, or in the interest of the state. Every one of the Okinawan people learned the preciousness and dignity of human life through the terrible consequences of the battle. That attitude had much to do with making certain the 1995 memorial honoured the dead of all nationalities. It was the Peace Park's stand of marble walls that prompted the American journalist to compare it to Washington's Vietnam Wall, in turn prompting Ota's, "But there are no Vietnamese names on the Vietnam Wall." Elected governor of the prefecture in November 1990, Ota served 2 terms through 1998. Although he enjoyed the company of Americans and often visited the United States, his platform focused on anti-militarism in general and the drastic reduction of the American bases in particular. The Okinawan worldview, he wrote, gives supremacy to human life and dignity. It gives value to friendly trade with neighbouring countries, to hospitality based on mutual understanding, to peaceful coexistence. That self-advertisement is essentially accurate, perhaps because natives continued to think of themselves as Okinawan, whether they were governed by Japan or America. Their attitudes are of course changing, as all do, especially with increasing globalization, but to a great degree they remain rooted in old island ways rather than in the presumption that underlies the American and Japanese calling to perform world missions. Maybe their fundamental virtue is simply being unable to dictate to others. Littleness can be a blessing in a world shaped by ambitious giants. A week or two in their amiable company raises questions about the wisdom of bigger peoples burdened by believing they've been chosen to shape others in their image.